iPredict works by gathering the knowledge of its 5,000 plus traders. If a stock has a price of 57 cents, that means the market thinks that event has a 57% chance of happening. If you agree, you buy. If you disagree, you short. And if you're right, you make money. Kia ora, good evening New Zealand. This is day 5 until the country goes to the polls. Welcome to iPredict Election 2011, the most accurate source of political and economic information in New Zealand broadcasting. Our 3 predictions tonight. Prediction 1. iPredict market is saying National at 48%. Roy Morgan this week says 53%. Would you buy iPredict at 48 or has Roy Morgan got it wrong? Prediction 2. iPredict market is saying Labour at 29% party vote. Roy Morgan this week says 24.5%. Would you short iPredict or buy Roy Morgan's prediction? Prediction 3. iPredict market is saying New Zealand first at 4.7%. Roy Morgan says 3%. Would you buy iPredict or sell Roy Morgan's prediction? To dissect these predictions, let me introduce tonight's panel. She is from Roy Morgan and is a special guest this evening, flying in to promote the new Roy Morgan reactor being used to measure viewer response in the TV3 leaders debate, Michele Levine. And he is the political columnist for the National Business Review, moral shepherd of the right, Matthew Hooton. Welcome to you both. We'll also wrap the show with a final prediction, but let's kick things off tonight with the first market prediction. iPredict says National will gain 48% party vote. Roy Morgan says 53%. Who is right? Michele, one of the immediate criticisms of the landline polls is that they underrepresent the voice of the poor. In New Zealand, 3 times as many young voters are without landlines compared to the general population, and for poorer households, it is twice as many. Even with the weighting included, landline polls in a recession this steep means the government support is overinflated, isn't it?
No, I don't think so. The Morgan poll actually has landlines and mobile phone lines, so we do a reasonably good job of getting a hold of the way people are actually going to vote.
Yep. And so you think that it's actually it's spot on and you aren't underrepresenting?
No, I don't think we're underrepresenting too many people in New Zealand, not on something like this.
We've had 2 examples recently, I suppose in the last 3 years, the Digi Herald poll, which had Len Brown and John Banks neck and neck. Len Brown won by 45 to, I think, 49 to 35%, and the Te Tokoro by-election, which also was a landline poll, Hone Harawira was said to be ahead by only 1%. He ended up being ahead by over 9%. In a recession this steep, with so few people on landlines, less now, how are you able to get those people?
There's lots of people on landlines. The vast majority of people are actually on landlines or have mobile phones, so you get a fairly good representation.
And what's the mix between landline polls
and
what's the mix between landline polls and cell phones?
The vast majority are done with landlines.
Okay, so it's only a small percentage on cell phones on the polls?
Absolutely.
And that's getting you the guaranteed numbers?
Absolutely. No problem.
Matthew, the theory behind wisdom of crowds, which the iPredict market runs on, works when investors are purely interested in profit after a rational analysis of the political landscape. But publicity from sudden turns on the market gives every potential for speculative manipulation. Can the market predict an election accurately?
There's a whole lot of academic literature that's a little bit beyond me, that began at the University of Iowa and other universities, Ivy League universities have studied this, that says that when people try and manipulate the iPredict market, that's actually a good thing because it creates more profit opportunities for people, so more people come into the market and it corrects. So, I mean, we've seen a few efforts to manipulate the market during the selection campaign, some from what looked like Labour activists trying to push Labour's vote up, and others from National activists trying to push National's vote up. It all corrects with a few hours. I think one of the things that iPredict has, it's an advantage over traditional polling, is firstly, iPredict's looking forward. So it's not saying what did you think a week or so ago. It's saying what do you think will happen on the day in a week's time in this case. It's also not saying who will you support, it's who do you think the community will support. And also it's very informationally efficient. So it takes into account the results of all polls, including Roy Morgan's, which has a good reputation. It's good to know that cell phones are used. But in the end, iPredict has an inherent advantage over traditional polling for those 3 factors, because it's looking forward, it's taking into account all the polling results, and that's what we know from what happened in New Zealand 3 years ago when iPredict had just started. iPredict still outperformed all the polls.
With recessions this steep, Michele, what are the concerns that people won't have landline usage, and so you are actually missing a large chunk of the vote?
I think this is a complete furphy. I don't think the landline issue is an issue at all. I think the whole issue with these polls is that you're doing it one way, we're actually asking people how they're going to vote and how they're going to vote if an election were held today. So you're absolutely right. If you're polling weeks earlier than the election, a whole lot can happen in that time. So the real trick is to get a good sample and ask them as close to the election how they're actually going to vote. So that's really the issue. The questions matter, a good sample, but don't get hung up on landlines and phone lines. It's really not.
I think there's something in that. I mean, Bomber, you make it. You were concerned that landlines underestimate the left's vote, the Mana Party's vote in particular. The poor. Because
we've had two examples.
Your argument is that the poor don't have landlines.
That's correct.
They only have cell phones.
That's correct.
But you know, at the other end of town, there's plenty of people in Remuera and Grey Lynn and St Mary's Bay that choose not to have a landline because they just use cell phones. Well, they probably tend to be more right-wing voters.
Absolutely. But in poorer communities, that is twice as likely not to have.
Funnily enough, the ACT Party makes the same complaint about the polls as you do, because they say that their supporters tend to only use cell phones, don't answer their landlines. And in the case of ACT, of course, and other parties, I think this is true for. I mean, remember, 1 million New Zealanders have already fled from New Zealand's economic decline. And so one of the things no pollster can look at is what the offshore voters are going to vote for.
Right.
So, look, no one claims any poll is correct in terms of anticipating what might happen in an election. It is only a snapshot on what happened on a particular day.
Well,
and that's the advantage iPredict has. It's not a poll.
On that point, what point do these systems stop representing public opinion and start to manipulate public opinion?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I don't think that, maybe the iPredict one does. I'm very interested in how that works. But what we're doing, what the Morgan poll does, is ask people how they're going to vote. And it represents it. I think it's a terrific thing that you can actually find out from people how they're feeling, rather than have, politicians or journalists or someone like you telling the population how they think. I don't think it's clear that if you've actually got a very strong, say, National Party vote, does that mean that people swing in behind the winner? They say they do in America. But in Australia, for instance, we believe that we're more likely to support the underdog.
Okay.
So,
right. So it's different actually on the
knows?
culture. Different on the culture.
Absolutely. Okay. So in my view, the key thing is to just keep these polls in perspective. They're an important measure of how people are feeling and thinking at the moment. And I think the important issue here is Roy Morgan's done 66 polls since 2009, and the vast majority of them had the Nationals polling well over 50%. None of them had the Nationals under 48.5, whereas at the election we actually underestimated the national vote. So there's a clear message here that at least up until your teapot scandal, the Nationals looked absolutely set to walk this election in.
Michele might well be more objective than I am. I mean, that's what exactly coming from Australia.
The Prime is a personal friend, isn't it?
I guess the reason I believe that the number is more likely to be iPredict's 48% and not Roy Morgan's 53%, I guess, is because, as a student of New Zealand politics to some extent, I look at New Zealand history, and the only time that a party has ever got more than 50% of the vote was in 1951 when after the attempted sort of coup d'etat by the unions, the waterside unions, Sid Holland cracked down on them.
Great moment in New Zealand history.
And he called an election after that sort of attempted coup by the unions, and he got 54% of the vote. The public backed him against the unions. That's the only time it's happened. I mean, Longy was unbelievably popular when you think about it in '87. And he was a rock star just like John Key. He only got 48%.
That's right.
I just emotionally, I find it difficult to accept John Key will get much more than 50%. My personal view is he'll get somewhere between about 47 and 50, but as a national voter, if Roy Morgan's right, I'll be cracking up champagne.
Until last week, the stars were all aligned for the Nationals. There's no question. we ask a question about whether New Zealand is heading in the right direction, and 60.5% of people in New Zealand said yes. Now put that against really tough economic times in New Zealand. They are still supportive of the government and saying the country's going in the right direction. The most
Those who have
important...
landlines. Those who have landlines.
You get over it.
Yeah.
But, you know,
Do you think there's some validity to the argument about the different cultures in terms of America would want to back the person who's out in front, but in Australia they might want to swing behind the underdog? How do you think it plays out in New
Probably
Zealand?
both ways. But look, some left-wing writers like Chris Trotter, he argues that there should be some sort of ban on the reporting of polls
that's
during
Winston
election.
Peters. That's
And
always
Winston
been his
Peters,
position.
Yes.
Yep.
mind you, he always has had fascist tendencies. But I mean, to me, the provision of information to voters, especially in New Zealand with proportional representation, to me it's highly relevant. And you have to trust that the polls, they're not perfect, but are somewhat accurate. Now, if I don't know, I'm not, but if I was a Christian fundamentalist that was appalled that John Key had supported Sue Bradford and Helen Clark's anti-smacking legislation, and I want to vote for the Conservative Party so that I can smack my kids again, right? Now, if I saw that that party was at 4.9%, that would tell me I should vote for it because it'll make a difference with the MMP threshold. If I know that it's 1%, I know I'll be wasting my vote. I think it's silly to say that voters should be deprived that type of information as long as the polls are at least broadly right, but they have been in most elections.
Right. Question to both of you. At 48% party vote and iPredict, would you short it because the market have overinflated Nationals win, or buy because Roy Morgan on 53% are right? You're going to be going with your own, you're backing your own numbers?
Going with our poll, but we will be polling again Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. If iPredict can change, so will we. A lot's happened since then.
Where are you?
48.
You've been claiming 50%.
Yeah, but roughly speaking, I think 48 is appropriately priced. There's not much profit between 48 and 50. I'm not trading in Nationals
Really
Party vote any
holding?
longer.
You're holding? That's
I'm
it.
just holding.
You're holding, not
holding
going
at
any
48.
further. Thank you, panel. Let's move on to prediction 2. iPredict market is saying Labor at 29% party vote. Roy Morgan this week says 24.5. Would you short iPredict and buy Roy Morgan's prediction? Michele, if landline polls are only adjusted for age and sex and the weighting only reinforces one type of view, political parties like Labor, who source a large amount of support from lower socioeconomic voters, will always be underrepresented in landlines. And does that sway undecided towards the perceived winner?
Get over it. It's not about landlines, and it's a long time since poor people voted Labor and rich people voted National. The world's moved on from that. I don't think this is an issue. I think what the Morgan poll at the moment has Labor at 24.5, which I think is the lowest that we've seen for a very long time. I think that's probably undercooked. And I think the Greens at the moment, who are polling at 13% according to the Morgan poll, have gained at Labor's expense. Now, typically, we'll see the Greens come back at an election. So it's likely that the Labor Party will actually poll a little bit better than that.
So it's a bit of aspiration for the Green vote, but on the actual election day, it pulls back a little bit.
There is an aspiration for the Green vote, but we have to be aware that around the world, the Greens are changing. The Green Party in New Zealand or Australia or anywhere else is no longer tree-hugging lunatics, which people thought they were.
Well, no, that's right. The Green movement, ironically, has become a globalised movement. It's like McDonald's or Coca-Cola or the Ford Motor Company.
Well, they would say very unlike those national brands.
Well, no, but they're not really. I mean, they're very similar. I mean, there's a head office in Amsterdam in the Green movement, and they do operate as a franchise arrangement the same way McDonald's does. So, and we are seeing around the world different Green parties seem to be deciding, whether independently or because a decision's been made in Amsterdam, that you know, they should pretend that they're moderate and so forth. And they now run, I think, Bavaria. They've won an election there in Germany, and they're running the state government there. So, you know,
they're not going to win the election in New Zealand, though.
No.
But what they are doing in New Zealand and Australia is they're actually drawing votes from people who are not comfortable with some of the choices that the major parties are making, which are the more populist choices. So on that basis, the Greens are serious, but often, you know, they're not always manning all the booths and things like that, so that you would expect that their vote would come back a little bit and Labor would actually improve.
So you think that Labor vote will actually strengthen up?
I think it may well strengthen up, yes.
I mean, you'd expect so, because the Roy Morgan poll at 24 seems very, very low.
That's the lowest that we've ever had.
Lowest they've ever had them.
Yes.
But, isn't it?
But you're...
I think so.
But the only thing is about that is that poll was taken before the weekend's events, where for a second and then a third time, Phil Goff was unable to competently account for his own fiscal policy. I mean, the first time it happened was some weeks ago, and John Key asked him what the revenue would be from Labor's capital gains tax, a new tax on families,
and
when it would happen.
Yeah.
And Phil Goff made a total turkey of himself, as we know.
Show me the money.
And you'd think that, and Key made exactly. And here's the thing: you'd think Phil Goff would have gone and learnt those numbers.
He'd have them tattooed on his eyelids,
but then he went on TV3, pre-recorded on Friday.
The Nation.
Didn't know the numbers again, made a fool of himself then. TV3 on Friday night ran that tomorrow we're running this interview saying that Phil Goff doesn't know his own fiscal numbers.
Yep. I bet he'll know them by tonight with the debate. I bet he'll have learned them from the debate.
Then, it's unbelievable, it would never happen in Australia. He then goes on Sunday morning on Q&A, Television New Zealand, and he's asked the same question again. It still doesn't know
It's almost like an intellectual tick now, that as soon as the question comes up, he kind of flinches from it.
Well, one of the things I think you can say, Phil Goff's compared himself to the French rugby team, which I think's unwise because it means the national party of the All Blacks, right? But there might be something in it. Maybe actually in a funny way, Phil Goff is not the All Blacks we know this year, but the All Blacks of the last 20 years at World Cups. And he chokes. Whenever this question comes up, he must know the answer. 78 million in 2015. Even I know the number.
Matthew, right? Labour's fortunes have mirrored John Key's perceived media gaffes. Are Labour Party speculators being overtly optimistic, or does the market believe Labour's core support is higher than the landline?
Oh no, I'm sure that they believe that their core support is higher than 28%, certainly higher than Roy Morgan's 24%. But you know, with a leader that can't answer question, they might be
that 24.5 might actually
I predict might be overestimating Labour's support at present. Yeah.
Are you kidding me? At 20, really?
Well, why on earth would you, if you're Labour, if you're left wing, you've got the Mana Party that does genuinely want to fight for the poor. You've got the Green Party that genuinely wants to fight for the environment. Why would you vote for a Labour Party that doesn't even know what its own capital gains tax is going to raise in revenue?
Let's get a question to both of you. The Roy Morgan reactor, which we used on the TV3 leaders debate, measures voters' reactions to what the Labour and national leaders say. But how valid is such a device if it's only accessible by smartphone app and can be used by someone as unbalanced as Lord Monckton to convince 9% of viewers that his climate denial quack science was persuasive? I mean, there is a concern
Lord Monckton is very persuasive. He could persuade on any issue. There's no question.
He may well be that, but he's also, I think, regarded by most of the scientific community to be so fringe. He's like a creationist at
but you know what? That's what's so powerful about this. By the way, that was actually an online reactor, so it was not just a smartphone app. But let's be clear. What's happening is in the studio at TV3, what we'll have is 80 to 100 people with these dials. Now they're a well-chosen group of people. They're not just landline people.
But
they're not just lunatic fringe. They're not just smartphone people.
But they're weighted to the actual population.
They are. They will represent the population, and they will be indicating how they feel, positively or negatively, about what they're seeing. And that really is the key scientific piece. There's no question. That's the line or the worm that you'll see on TV3 tonight. But apart from that, for the first time in the world, so you in New Zealand should be very proud, we're actually having people with their smartphones all over New Zealand having an opportunity to say what they think. And from time to time, TV3 will actually switch to the broader New Zealand audience.
But
and we'll see whether they're more or less.
Broader New Zealand audience, that automatically, because of the smartphone app, it makes it a certain socioeconomic group who are going to be having their opinion viewed, isn't it?
Yes.
How clear will it be made to the viewers who are watching that this is an elite opinion, or this is an opinion from people who have got the money?
It's kind of interesting. It's not just that elite. Lots of young people have iPhones.
So the next generation of voters?
Absolutely. A lot of tradespeople have gone phone rather than internet. So don't get hung up on saying it's all that elite. However, I'm not in any way claiming that this is a cross-section of New Zealand. It's a bunch of people who are interested.
If someone like Lord Monckton, who is a fruitcake and a banana, can get the kind of reaction that he did out of this type of device, isn't that a bad thing for democracy?
I think there's two groups here that you're talking about. The first one is where there's so-called undecided voters. Now, we used this, I think, in the 1996 election.
Peter Dunn.
Well, no, that was 2002.
Okay.
96 was Helen Clark against Jim
right.
Bolger.
That's right.
And there was theoretically this group of undecided voters who had these things. And I'm sure it's more sophisticated now. But what we as the National Party discovered afterwards is, yes, they were undecided voters. They were undecided between Labor and the Alliance. so poor old Jim Bolger, whatever. And the thing is,
Every time he
we
came on
did
screen.
actually win that election. We got about 40% of the vote.
Right.
But every time Jim Bolger comes on, he's anyway.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there is that problem with the wider thing. I think there's some pluses and minuses of that. I think the important thing is the media reports the results responsibly.
Yes.
I mean, an initial reaction is valid, but it could be wrong. I mean, I'm looking at this teapot issue. Now, I was asked to go and do some political commentary immediately after John Key walked out of his press conference with Federated Farmers, right? And I went and said, oh, John Key stuffed this up, it's a disaster, he's hopeless and all that sort of thing. And then I thought about it, found out some more information, understood that he had actually polled it.
They sent you your
well,
your
no, it
orders.
was a bit of both.
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
And then I was actually, no, that was a smart political move. And often when we think about things and learn more,
Counterintuitive.
we have a more sophisticated response to something that's happened. Now, as long as this, worm thing is understood to just be an initial response,
Absolutely.
and we don't get the news media saying, overwhelming win for, and I think it will be John Key. I think the worm is going to be kind of John
Every
Key.
time he comes on, I love him.
So,
okay,
but I think it's important that the media doesn't report John Key wins just because the worm says
Can
so.
I make a point? That don't get hung up on the sample. I keep saying this to you. We will be looking at how essentially Labor voters respond to these things. We'll be looking at how National voters respond and how Green voters. We'll be looking at how young voters think about it and how older voters. So anyone who wants to look at this will simply be able to look at that extra dimension and understand the differences.
I'm sure it's more sophisticated than 15 years ago.
With the iPredict market saying 29% party vote for Labor and the Roy Morgan saying 24%, who's right?
Again, I'd back iPredict. I can't, I hope Labor gets 24, but I can't quite believe it will happen.
He hopes 24.
I'm backing Roy Morgan's next poll. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday.
Thank you, panel. Moving on, prediction 3. Last week, Roy Morgan had New Zealand first at 4.5%. This week, after heavy media coverage, New Zealand first has apparently slumped to 3%, while iPredict have New Zealand first at 4.7%. Michele, with MMP as our electoral system, are landline polls good at representing a smaller party? Because a 1.5% discrepancy in a week for a minor party is a vast drop-off in support, isn't it?
Look, maybe. I don't think it's a landline thing. I think these polls all have a little bit of up and down. And I think what we've seen with Winston Peters, who needs 5% to, that magical 5%, in our 66 polls, New Zealand first has been at 5% only twice.
Right.
So the 4.5 was maybe a little bit higher than he really was. Maybe 3 is a little bit low. But, the key thing is we think that the whole teapot saga will actually give Winston Peters the sort of oxygen that he needs to get his awareness raised. What minor parties need is to have their awareness raised. They need to be upfront for the electorate, whereas the major parties actually have to make sure they don't put a foot wrong. Different game.
Matthew, are minor parties open to more speculation on the iPredict market? I mean, ACT at 3.1 on the iPredict market looks optimistic in the extreme, doesn't it?
Yeah, intuitively, I'll come back to that. Intuitively, I think that New Zealand first will probably be between that 3 and that 4.5 that Roy Morgan's saying.
So you're not saying over 5%?
No, I
don't. You refuse to
so.
believe it?
No, I mean, I'd be interested to know. It's a big fluctuation, 4.5 to 3, but you've got a small party that practices the politics of hate. It has a.
In your opinion.
A divisive party.
Yeah, a divisive party.
And it fluctuates. And I guess with Michele here, it'd be interesting to know the Australian experience with Pauline Hanson, who's the politician in Australia that's most similar to Winston Peters. How did she poll in
what you can
Roy
find
Morgan?
with a Pauline Hanson type poll is that people actually don't want to admit that they're going to vote for her.
Well,
and that can be a major issue, so it can underpoll.
Okay.
So that's the other sort of issue.
So he might
actually
actually be over 5.
Although in New Zealand, that's different because Winston and Pauline very similar in their politics, but he tends to poll on the day under what he gets in the polls. So on your question about iPredict, there is an issue because of the way we structured the contracts for this election. for these small parties.
That's right.
And to buy New Zealand First, or one of those parties, those small parties, it costs you 5 cents. So you buy 100 shares, it costs you $5. But to short it would cost you $950 at that price.
Right,
so I
right.
think probably if there's a problem with iPredict, if there's an error in the iPredict market, I think probably we're slightly overestimating the small parties' votes, including New Zealand First and ACT.
That
and
sounds
United
much worse
Future.
than a landline
No,
issue.
it certainly does, doesn't it? Question to both of you. How can minority opinion be reflected in polls, especially when within the MMP dynamic they're so important to the final equation? How can those small parties really lift their presence?
How can they? They need to get noticed.
Yep.
That's the key thing. They need to be seen, and that's very difficult for a small party unless they do something outrageous.
Yeah.
Yeah. But can I make one really important point? Every time we do election day surveys, 22% of the people make up their mind in the polling booth.
Right. So almost a quarter. Almost a quarter of the voters.
Almost a quarter. So when we talk about people just giving a sort of flippant thought about what they're seeing, we need to realise the vast majority of people in New Zealand, Australia and anywhere else don't care nearly as much as we do and the politicians do about it all. So we get hung up about these things and the detail. At the end of the day, it's about being seen, being recognised by the people, and then for the major parties to look like leaders and to look like they actually have a clear way forward.
With the iPredict market predicting 4.7 and Roy Morgan predicting 3%, who's right
well,
on New Zealand First?
I would short New Zealand First at 4.7 because I think it'll be about 4.1, 4.2, but as I said, it's too expensive to. So,
but just on that, if you look at the 2008 result, 4.1 is what he got last time. That was after, what was it, almost 6 months of the most intensive attack in the media. You're saying that he's still only getting 4.1% this time?
I wouldn't characterise it as attack. I think there was 6 months of some
feeding frenzy.
No, I think some facts about that man and his corrupt practices became
public.
That's how I would see it, and that informed the voters, and they voted accordingly. And I think many people do understand that he is a person, of course, who lied about where his funding came from, who consistently has lied about who and how he will behave as a politician, and I mean that's always been my opinion.
So you think it'll be the same now?
And according to most of the polls, most New Zealanders also believe that he's a liar.
What's at 4.7 or 3%? Where do you think New Zealand First?
I don't think you can tell. I think the debate tonight will actually be very, very crucial. If the debate focuses on economic issues and the real things that New Zealanders want to hear about prior to the election, it will be a very different game. If the debate turns on things like the teapot saga and all sorts of silliness, I think it will open the door for people like Winston Peters, the Greens, and other people will rise to fill that void.
And I'll tell you what, your poll rating will be right if Phil Goff can't remember how much revenue the
capital
government.
It'll actually be very lower. That's right. Thank you, panel. Let's wrap the show with the final prediction. Matt, your final prediction tonight is?
iPredict has launched stocks asking for the gap between Labour
and the Greens.
And the Greens, and the stock saying, will the gap be 10, 12 and a half, or 15? I think it will be more than 10, but I think that the 12.5 and 15 are good buys. I mean, with 15 it only has to be like 13.28, and that pays $1, and it's trading at about 50 cents.
Thank you, Matt.
That's another language. I don't know what you're talking about.
Final prediction tonight.
iPredict's the future.
No. The reactor is the future. I believe that the reactor will win tonight. And I think the Nationals will poll extremely well. Whether they actually get in on their own or not will remain to be seen.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Matt. To my final prediction, the Epsom Teapot tapes haven't damaged support with National Party voters who were already voting for John Key after his cannibalism joke, camp mincing at the Rugby World Cup volunteers launch, or his joke about buying the BMWs. Any comments Key made about New Zealand First voters dying off would be water off a duck's back. However, the gagging of the media by the police, Key's bizarre comparisons to phone hacking murdered children's families, the possibility of increased youth suicide, and claiming that with low crime the police had time to execute 4 search warrants on our largest broadcasters Key has damaged his reputation with the 10% don't knows. I'm still shorting National Party vote at any price down to 44%. On the panel tomorrow night, I'm joined by economist Bernard Hickey and Green Party co-leader Russell Norman. Follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter and Facebook accounts for all my latest election updates. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you again 7 p.m. tomorrow night for iPredict Election 2011, exclusively on Stratus TV. Until then, get trading.